Hello, my biology Homo sapiens. Okay, let me make it bigger. So, funny story. I was just going through this lecture and thinking this would have been really good right before cell membrane and osmosis, but you know, will be good for next year. Oh, sorry. No, I really think like this is some stuff that we've already gone over. So, hopefully, this is like, yeah, I know. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know. And write it down. Okay. Topic 2.2 is all about water. Why Mrs. Myers loves water. Why is water the best? Okay. So, our topic I outlined, some of you really mentioned in your post test things that you really liked that objective sheet that I gave you. So, just kind of at the end, I'm going to go through it. So you can do one of two things on our outline at the end, like, do you know this? You can either, I will give you another copy of it again, but if you want to stop and test yourself, some of you also put in your after post test that you felt like you should test yourself more after each lecture. So just some things to do, if you have time in all your spare time. Okay, it's going to be talking about the structure of water, a lot of stuff we've already talked about with bonding and properties and cohesion, and why it's so important, right? Why water is so important. Okay, so let's start out with the structure of water. I know we have gone over this again. It's still up on the board, and I can't find, there we go. Okay, so water is made of two hydrogens and atoms covalently bonded to an oxygen molecule. Make sure that you know those covalent bonds. Just for now, that should be a little bit of review from chemistry, but I know not everyone took it, right? But ionic bonds are different from covalent bonds, right? So our covalent bonds were actually sharing those electrons, but what that does to our molecule is it makes it polar. And we've already looked at water drops on a penny and the cohesion of water. So because I get this oxygen with the electron orbitals up here with a slightly negative, I have more electrons up here, and because my hydrogen is giving that electron to the oxygen, I get slightly positive here, right? So electrons are negative, and so without that, I get a positive and a positive. And so because we have those polarity, right, the polarity of water, we get the attraction to each other, right? So it attracts. So sorry, kind of skipping over. So the oxygen is going to be the one that pulls away those electrons, and I get this kind of polar molecule. It talks about why that's important in the next slide, right? And so we call this unequal electron distribution a permanent dipole, right? A dipole or a dipole. So meaning two pole, like having the two positive and negative, right? So oxygen is negative, hydrogen is positive. Okay, so I've got this polar molecule and we've already looked at its cohesion bond. So how that helps it stick to each other is that I get the negatives of that oxygen attracted to the positives of the hydrogens on the next molecule. So when I get a lot of these molecules together, they're sticky, right? So we call them like sticky. They like to be cohesive. Cohesion is to stick to itself. Adhesion is to stick to something else, right? So the dipolarity of water allows it to form these little polar bonds with all the other, they're not actually bonds, but they're associations with other molecules around them. Really strong, those what we call those hydrogen bonds, because I get them forming here, right, and here and here. And so those associations that form between hydrogens and fluorine, oxygen, and nitrogen, my hydrogen bonds are strong bonds, right? That's because hydrogens have there's only one electron, right? So they have very weak electronactivity, and those other ones are fluorine, oxygen, and nitrogen have very strong. And so anytime we see hydrogen bonds with those three atoms, we get these polar molecules. Okay. And then we've talked about already without those water molecules, they collectively form these hydrogen bonds, and that makes them kind of stick to each other. Okay, so let's talk about the three properties of water that make it different or distinct from other things and why we've already talked a little bit about how it's neutral, right? So it's a great place for chemical reactions to occur because it's a neutral solution. But the thermal properties, talking about heat, this comes into play a little bit more. So my thermal properties, heat exchange, actually, water can actually absorb a lot of heat before it changes state, right? So it takes a lot of heat to take, a water from a liquid to a gas, right? And so that allows it to hold heat and then release heat at a very slow rate. This is really important for regulating climates along the coast. I know this is not in here, but I'm bringing in my earth science stuff. I love earth science. But when I look at climates near the coastal areas, they have the same weather all year long. So large bodies of water take in heat and they keep it. And so that regulates the temperatures around it, versus places like the desert or places that have very little water absorb heat very quickly and then release heat. Like deserts get really hot and really cold. So thermal properties, water is able to absorb a significant amount of heat and keep it before it actually evaporates. Okay. We just talked about the cohesive adhesive properties. So water sticks cohesion to each other. It sticks to other substances, which is adhesion, right? So ever seen like water molecules coming down, or like rain, I guess you can call them rain, not water molecules, coming down the windshield when it rains, how they kind of collect together, right? So water molecules like they bubble up, and we saw that on top of our penny. Okay. The other thing that's really unique about water is that it has this ability to dissolve polar and ionic substances. So it's able to transport. Oh my gosh, our whole last unit. Water is a great way to transport substances, right? It makes an effective transport medium. Some other things are not so much, right? So not as easy to dissolve because it doesn't have those polarities of those different, what I want to say, ionic substances, right? So it doesn't dissolve it as well because it's not polar. Okay. All right. So going a little bit back to the coolant part, the thermal properties. So this just repeats what we just said. So the reason why that it's able to absorb all that heat without changing is, again, because of the hydrogen bonding. Everything is because of hydrogen bonding, right? And so the extensive hydrogen bonding between water molecules, they all need to be broken. So it's not only that I need to break the bonds between the water molecule, but I need to break the bonds of the surrounding water molecules, right? Because they're all kind of stick together. And so that takes a lot of energy, right? It's just a lot easier to, like rubbing alcohol. You can just put rubbing alcohol on your skin and it evaporates right away, right? You put water on your skin, not so much. So different points at which it takes to make it a vapor. So we call this highly effective coolant, right? Because it takes so much energy to make it evaporate. This is why our body produces water to cool us off. So think about like you've got sweat coming to your skin, right? It's not the actual water that cools you off. It's when it leaves your skin, because when water becomes a vapor, it takes the heat with us, right? So my hot skin produces sweat. The heat causes evaporation. And when that evaporates, it takes the heat with it, right? The heat absorbs and it cools that water heat light. So think about when you get out of the pool in the summer, well, actually anytime, it's like 100 degrees outside, but when you are covered with water, you're freezing because it's evaporating really quickly and it's taking all that heat with it. Okay. All right. Another special property, right? I'm sorry. This is just a little bit of comparison. So this is looking at methane and water actually have about really size, weight, orbital formations. You want to get all chemical about it. They have pretty similar. But they have different thermal properties because water forms hydrogen bonds with each other. So here's a lot of fancy numbers. So methane is CH4. You can look at like it has about the same amount of bonds. We still get the little bit of the pulse here, but it freezes at negative 182 and it boils at negative 161. So really short range between the two, right? The heat capacity, what we call that, is 2.2. It's really small. Right? And this is the change in heat and the change in vapor. So you don't need to know these things right here, but it's just showing you that very small difference that creates those polar bonds creates a huge range of which it goes from a freezing to a boiling, right? This is only 20-ish degrees and this is 100. Okay. All right. A little bit back to cohesive and adhesive. Because it has those intermolecular associations, it shares a lot of the properties. So a single molecule is going to share a lot of the properties as a lot of other molecules together, right? So it fills these bonds. This is basically, it's kind of saying the same thing, right? But the thing that's new on this, so the adhesion, is that water interacts with polar ionic, but it will not interact with non-polar molecules. Non-polar, let's see. Oh, we'll talk about things that don't dissolve in water or adhesive. Oil in water, not very good, right? But anyways, because it does that, because it sticks to each other, this is my actions just thinking off, I get a lot of surface tension and capillary action. So the surface tension, remember you saw on the top of your penny, right? It was completely like over, right? Gravity was not acting on it. It was all staying together because it creates like this cohesive unit. Right? It also, because it once sticks together, capillary action, so actually moving up in plants. So those two things are really important for all life functions. Okay. The third property that we said was really important was solvent, right? So it's called a universal solvent. It can dissolve a lot of different things, right? And again, it is that way because there's a lot of space in between because they're being pulled to each other. So if this is my salt crystal, so look at how like these are all positive right here. So those kind of dissolve the positive regions and all the negatives take in the negative regions. So and NaCl is plus in my, so we have my positive sodiums, my negative chlorides. This is so chemistry related. But because I have those different areas of negativity and positivity, it makes it easier for that substance to dissolve. Okay. These are what we call hydration shells when they're dissolved. So as you can see, my oxygen part here, right, the bigger one here, is attracted to the positive here, and then my positives are attracted to the negative. So it creates these dissolved kind of like bubbles. And it's just know that it makes it a lot easier to dissolve substances because of its polarity. Okay. The other thing is solubility, which we have gone all through: solution, solubility, and solvent. So hopefully this feels a little, what do I say, of a review too. We've already talked about hydrophilic and hydrophobic when we're talking about our phospholipids, but now you can kind of use them as a review with solvents, right? Solvents and solubility. So substances that freely associate and dissolve are called hydrophilic because they have all those polar molecules, and substances that do not are called hydrophobic, right? So water loving, water hating. Don't use those terms. So hydrophobic substances include things like fats and oil. That's what we just talked about, right? So water loving, right? Or hydrophobic is like oils. They do not have those same polarities, and so they do not dissolve in water. One of the reasons why you're like they solidify and come out of water. Not great for your heart, right? Cholesterol, fats, those things that get stuck in there. Okay. All right. The other cool thing that you guys have already learned a ton about is transport solubility, because it is and does dissolve a lot. We get blood that's able to move it around really quickly. Here's some common water soluble substances. So sodium chloride, glucose, sugars, right? Can move all around those sugars and the salts in the blood super easy. Amino acids, which is what I make my proteins from. Oxygen in low amounts, right? So my red blood cells are able to move oxygen around. The one thing that they can't, or some things that they can't, right? Lipids and cholesterols and fats we just talked about, packaged with proteins for transport, right? And so these things are insoluble. That's why because they're packaged with those for transport, right? So my lipids, cholesterol, and fat are packaged with proteins so that they can actually move around, because while these two things, cholesterol and fat, are insoluble, they're not going to dissolve and move around in my blood. Okay. A couple more properties here. We talked about why it's so cool is that it's less dense when it's solid because it forms these rings. We talked about how important that is when ice is created and it moves to the top. It keeps our earth cool. It allows life in ponds. It reflects a more like thermal energy coming in. And so that's a really important function of water, is that it actually gets less dense and floats on top of liquid. The other one that's really important property is that it's transparent and you can see through it, because because of this, we get life in water, right? Because light can actually pass through and it's not absorbed to a certain depth. We can actually see photosynthesis occurring, which is where it occurred first. If we look back at the origin of our Earth, right? I'm trying to look through to see if there's anything else I didn't about. Water adapts to lattice, so it creates a bigger, more space, ice is lighter, life on Earth. Yep, I said all that. You can have it written down, but have it summarized there too. Okay. All right, here's my end of topic review. Can you do the following? Don't turn off this video. Can you describe the structure, the thermal properties? Can you compare water and methane, right? Don't necessarily know the numbers, but know like the ranges and what that is. What is cohesive versus adhesive, hydrophilic and hydrophobic, solvents and solutions, and why it's so important. Why is water so cool? We talked about it, but now you have it written down. All right, my friends, you have a beautiful weekend, and I will see you next week. Hope and show, and stop the recording.